I'm probably one of the few people who's both written for The Guardian and gotten mentioned in a Guardian hit piece. So there you go. Was looking at our music sheet, and maybe it's the name of it. It says, Pourquoi font bruit? Why make noise? I like that. I like that. Unlike in Europe, America never had a state church, but for most of our history, we had a sort of softly institutionalized generic Protestantism as our default national religion. So think back to as recently as the 1950s. Half of all adults attended church every week. That was actually the high watermark of church attendance in America. We had prayer and Bible reading in our public schools. We were adding "In God We Trust" to our money and "Under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance. It gives you a sense of the role Christianity played in society at that time, although kind of by the 50s, the generic Protestantism had kind of morphed into a generic Judeo-Christianity. But starting in the 1960s, this began to become unraveled, and the status of Christianity went into decline in America, a decline that continues to the present day. And I divide this period of decline from roughly 1964 to the present into three eras or worlds that I call the positive world, the neutral world, and the negative world. So the positive world lasts from 1964 to 1994. And I want to be clear about one thing. All is not going well for Christianity at that time. It wasn't positive in that sense. Church attendance was down. The sexual revolution is happening. And yet, Christianity was still basically viewed positively in society. To be known as a good church-going man made you seem like an upstanding member of society, made people want to hire you, made people want to vote for you. Christian morality was the basic morality of society, and if you violated those principles, you could get into real trouble. In 1994, we hit a tipping point and entered the neutral world, which lasted from 1994 to 2014. And in the neutral world, Christianity is no longer seen positively, but it's not really seen negatively yet either. It's just one more lifestyle choice in a sort of pluralistic public square, and Christian morality had a certain residual effect in society. Then in 2014, we hit a second tipping point and enter the negative world, where for the first time in the 400-year history of America, official elite culture now views Christianity negatively, or certainly at least skeptically. Perhaps that is a better way to put it. Of course, all throughout history, many people didn't believe. Our founding fathers, many of them were famously not especially devout. And yet Christianity was publicly held in honor. And that is what has changed. It's no longer publicly held in honor. To be known as a Bible-believing Christian does not help you get a job in the elite domains of society, although I would say it's not necessarily a killer either. It just gets you a little skepticism. It's certainly not an aid. It probably hurts, but, since I know many of you will want jobs, don't panic. But what I'd say is Christian morality is now expressly repudiated and is in many ways seen as a leading threat to the new public moral order. And this shift into a negative world has been profoundly dislocating to American evangelicals, to say the least. I like to try to bring the three worlds to life by illustrating the differences through the stories of three different presidential sex scandals. So the positive world sex scandal, as we wind the clock back to 1987, Colorado Senator Gary Hart is the leading contender to be the Democratic nominee for president the following year, when it was revealed in the Miami Herald that he had a young lady stay all night in his Washington, D.C. townhouse. It later came out that he'd been frolicking with her on his yacht, the Monkey Business. Literally the name of the yacht, the Monkey Business. And he was forced to drop out of the presidential race. In the 1980s, in the positive world, a politician having an affair could be a career ender. Fast forward to the neutral world, 1998. The Drudge Report breaks the story that President Bill Clinton has been having an affair with a White House intern. Now, this scandal badly damaged Bill Clinton. Make no mistake. It's probably the reason George W. Bush won the 2000 election. And yet, he survived it. As Democrats and even feminist groups rallied around him saying his personal behavior is not relevant to his public performance in office. The negative world. Fast forward, October 2016, NBC News has been sitting on a tape of Donald Trump on the set of Access Hollywood saying crude things about women. Now, they've had this tape for months, and they've just been waiting to drop it on him as an October surprise and sink his candidacy. But in retrospect, that was a 48-hour blip of a scandal. He went on to win an election shortly thereafter. And, Donald Trump illustrates the profound nature of the shift to the negative world. When I tell the story about the positive, neutral, negative world, I think our first reaction naturally is to ask, well, how does that affect us as Christians? But the reality is it doesn't just affect us. It has a pervasive impact throughout society. Donald Trump could only become president in a negative world. Donald Trump had talked about running for president since the 1980s, but he never did it. And I don't even count that fake 2012 Reform Party thing. That wasn't a serious bid because he knew he couldn't win. He couldn't win. But in 2015, he saw that something had changed in the culture, and now there was a path for someone like him to get elected president. And I think there's a tremendous irony that the very people who are the most horrified by Donald Trump are the ones who did some of the most work to tear down all the old moral standards that would have barred the way for someone like him to achieve the presidency. And I just want to give one example of why Donald Trump could never have gotten elected president prior to the negative world. In the 1980s, and then I think even into the early 1990s, Donald Trump owned gambling casinos in Atlantic City. Now, in the 1980s, it's hard to relate to this, but if you wanted to gamble in America, you had two basic choices. You could go to your local mob bookie and place a bet with him, or you could go to Las Vegas or Atlantic City and gamble in a casino that was also probably mob controlled. The idea that gambling was controlled by the mob was just common knowledge in our culture. And it was actually the case, in fact. But you can see it in the Godfather movies. It's like a central point of the plot of Godfather 2. So the idea that we would elect someone president who was in the gambling business is just inconceivable. Regardless of, whether he was involved with the mafia or not, I'm not saying he was, he would have been perceived as mobbed up. It would have been like electing that senator from Godfather 2 who's controlled by the mob to be the president. Well, today, gambling is ubiquitous, legal, culturally approved of. Even the sporting leagues are in on sports betting. It is completely normalized in our society. Just one example of that really struck me, I live in Indianapolis, so, the Colts, Peyton Manning, former quarterback of the Colts, his brother Eli, also a quarterback. They're now gambling pitchmen. And these were two guys that you would have said, these are like the ultimate clean-cut American boy types, at least in their public image. I don't know them personally, but they obviously had no concern that becoming a pitchman for gambling would affect their public brand, because it doesn't. Gambling is just, fully accepted in our society today. And so the idea that we would hold that against Donald Trump, it just doesn't matter anymore. So that's an example. And so I think the pervasiveness of gambling in our society is another example of the negative world. No surprise that, metastasized sports betting and the like came about in the negative world. Another one, drug legalization. Again, I don't think it's any surprise that the pot legalization movement really got going in the negative world. Now, every city you go to in America, you walk down the street, clouds of pot smoke everywhere, extremely unpleasant. Or we can also think about just simply unchecked greed in our society. Again, in the 1980s, which is when I was in high school and getting into college, most states had usury laws. So there were statutory caps on the amount of interest that you could charge borrowers. And the idea is that we needed to protect the vulnerable people from being taken advantage of by predatory financiers. Well, that's all gone today. And there's a payday loan store, right, on every block in a lot of these poor neighborhoods, typically owned by, a major multi-million-dollar corporation charging sometimes thousands of % interest on an APR rate on a loan. It used to be, the mob was a really big deal in our society. You don't hear much about the mob anymore. Well, one reason you don't hear much about the mob anymore is because we legalized all the things that the mob used to do, right? We legalized gambling. We legalized drugs. We legalized loan sharking. You don't need to go to the mob to get a predatory loan anymore. You just go down to the payday loan store and get 3,000% charge. There's even a huge move afoot among many to try to legalize, quote unquote, sex work. So they're going to take prostitution away, probably at some point. And that's just the nature of the world. And of course, many of these things are deeply harmful to lots and lots and lots of people. But unfortunately, the public wants it now because it's no longer the old culture that it used to be. So why did I pick these dates? I want to talk about that. That's a question I get a lot. Why did you pick these dates? I don't think there's anything magical about the dates. If you prefer different dates, pick different dates. And if there's a model that you think fits the world better, that you think has better explanatory power, use that one. I think to me, this is a lot like a periodization of history, like ancient, medieval, modern. It's a tool. It's a heuristic, right? It's not like, Newton's laws of motion or something. It's like an objective portrayal of reality. It's just a way to help us make sense of the world. So we shouldn't be afraid of looking at other ways to think about it, other ways to think about it. But why these dates? 1964 I picked because it was right about the time of the Kennedy assassination. I don't think there's anything about the Kennedy assassination that had anything to do with this, but it does seem to be the moment at which everything went crazy in America in the 1960s. 1994 is one I'd have the biggest debate about. I think it could have made an argument for 1989 because that was the year of the fall of the Berlin Wall, which is really, really significant. I'll talk about that in a second. But I went with 1994 because it was after the collapse of communism. It's right as baby boomers are taking leadership in our society. 1994 was also the year of the Newt Gingrich revolution, when Republicans captured control of the House of Representatives for maybe the first time in like 40 years or something like that. And that, in my opinion, was the high watermark of religious right influence in America as well. 1994 was also the year that Rudy Giuliani was elected mayor of New York. And that heralded a massive transformation of the cities for the better, a collapse of crime and the streaming into the cities of this new urban progressive demographic that has had so much influence in our society. And it's very difficult to relate to what cities were like, even in the early 1990s. In the early 90s, there were over 2,000 murders a year in New York. People carried mugger money in their shoe, so they had something to give. Everybody was a victim of a crime. If you think that cities got problems today, it's nothing like what it was in that era. In the mid-90s, crime collapsed in so many cities, massive comeback of the cities. 2014 is a little more dialed in, I think. Obviously, that's the year before the Obergefell decision that legalized gay marriage. 2014 was the year a number of people, including like left-wing secular pundits like Matthew Iglesias, said was the start of the Great Awakening on race, where we saw things like the use of terms like white supremacy in the media just explode. And by the way, this was before Donald Trump, so this can't be attributed to Donald Trump. People want to say everything's Trump's fault. It's not. But, Trump, is a sign of something happening. Runs for president in 2015. And then 2013 is when the NYU professor Jonathan Haidt first started noticing things getting a little crazy on college campuses. And so I think you could debate exactly which year you want to pick. But clearly there was a major break in the culture sometime in President Obama's second term that really hit us in this negative world. And again, is really, I think, caught people a little flat-footed. Another question I get, what caused the negative world? And I don't take a position on that. And there's a kind of a whole genre of thought around where did it all go wrong. So some people say it all went wrong with William of Ockham and nominalism back in the Middle Ages. I can't remember who originally came up with that. Was that Richard Weaver? Was Richard Weaver the guy that came up with that? Something like that. Yeah. Then there's, of course, Catholics like to say it all went wrong with the Reformation. A lot of people said the Enlightenment. It all went wrong with the Enlightenment. I don't take a position on that stuff. I think history is sort of a contingent outworking of many, many, many events. And I don't think there's any one kind of singular cause. But I do want to highlight a couple of milestones along the way to the negative world that were really, really, really critical. One is the collapse of the old Protestant establishment. And this is one that it's very hard for us to wrap our head around because the idea of social class in America is not something that we really understand. But this is really, really important. When you look back at American history, you cannot understand it without understanding social class. So up through the 1950s, America was dominated by a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant upper class, the WASP upper class. And when you hear the term WASP, it's used in two different senses that we have to understand. The first sense is just anybody who's like a white Protestant today, basically, would be called a WASP. But its original meaning was to an upper class, the American aristocracy, right? The equivalent of sort of the British aristocracy, you might think. And so Jimmy Carter was a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant, kind of ethnically, but he wasn't a WASP. He wasn't from the upper class. Whereas George H.W. Bush was a Connecticut blue blood. He was a WASP. He was like the last American WASP president. So really, through the whole history of America up through the 50s, these people, and of course, it morphed many, many, many times throughout that history, basically ran the country. They were basically the presidents. They were the heads of the universities. They were the captains of industry, right? They were all of these things. And it was not for nothing that there was a Protestant in their name. I mean, prior to World War II, America was basically an anti-Catholic country. I mean, at the American founding, this country was 98% Protestant. And it was a controversy that John F. Kennedy was Catholic when he ran for president. A lot of people the Pope's going to be giving him orders and things like that. And actually, if you look at John F. Kennedy, he's actually a perfect portrait of what a WASP would have looked like in that era, because he was imitating them to show that he belonged. And if you look at the pictures of his inauguration, there's a famous saying that people like to say is like, hats went away when John F. Kennedy didn't wear a hat to his inauguration. But in fact, he did wear a hat. In fact, if you look at him, he's wearing a morning coat. He's in like formal dress. You can look up some pictures of him. And Jews were basically blackballed from country clubs and things like that in that era. So as long as this group was running the show, it's highly unlikely that they would ever have allowed certainly Protestant Christianity to fall into disrepute, because it would have destroyed one of the things that defined their community. Now, these weren't religious people by and large, and if they were typically liberal Protestants. But Protestantism was very much part of their class identity. In the 60s, the establishment collapsed. And I would argue that the collapse of the establishment and the fall of the mainline denominations were enormous significance to our country. A lot of what ails our country comes about in part as a result of that. And as I said, you cannot understand American history or American culture if you don't understand this. Like, so much of the literature from prior to that era is predicated on it. So I don't know if you've ever seen the play, the Philadelphia Story. If you haven't, you can watch the film version of it. That'd be my assignment. You can either watch the Philadelphia Story or you could read The Magnificent Ambersons by Booth Tarkington. And matters of class are like a big, who's old money, who's new money. This plays so much into it. Even one of the things seminal events like the McCarthy, Senator Joseph McCarthy hearings and his anti-communist crusade, you can't understand the resentments of McCarthy and what he was doing unless you understand this class issue, because McCarthy was an Irish Catholic. And so up until the 50s and in that era, the WASPs had always looked down on the Catholic immigrants as not really fully authentically American. And what's happening is these immigrants have assimilated, and now they're asserting themselves in America, and he's turning the table on the WASPs. He's saying, no, you are the people who are betraying your country to the communists. You are the ones who are not authentically America. And of course, they didn't like that. So there's a lot going on in these socio-religious dynamics that it's really hard to pick up on if you don't keep that in mind. So something to think there. Another one was obviously the collapse of the Soviet Union, the fall of communism in 1989. Why were we adding "In God We Trust" to our money and "Under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance in the 1950s? Anybody?
Just like the Soviets?
Yeah. The Cold War. Yeah, we had the Cold War. And so in the Cold War, communism was this avowedly atheist, materialist system. And so Christianity was really bound up in religion in general with the West's sort of global, full-scale conflict against the Soviet Union. When the Soviet Union collapsed, that allowed our society to unbundle Christianity from what it meant to be a sort of Western, liberal, democratic society. It wouldn't have been possible prior to the Cold War. And again, the Cold War context is important to so much. One of the things I never learned and is still rarely discussed is the Cold War context of the civil rights movement. It's an era of decolonization. So you have all these newly independent countries in Africa. We're in a battle with the Soviets over influence. And part of this global propaganda war, is the Soviets are saying, look how Americans treat black people. That was their moral attack against us. I know a guy who's a foreign correspondent who was in Moscow during the 1968 riots. He said they played it nonstop on TV in Moscow. Look at America. Look at that. So the Cold War was a massive context for the civil rights movement. Very important to understand that. And why Northern elites were very interested in the civil rights movement. But yeah, those are a couple of things along the way, and a couple of things we really need to keep in mind as we think about American history. So how did evangelicals respond to this period of decline? And first is, I would say that evangelicalism is in many respects a product of this period of decline. In the 1950s, it was really mainline Protestantism that dominated the American religious landscape. Most people were mainline Protestants. But the mainlines went into decline in the 1960s, and they were never able to turn it around. They couldn't figure out how to adapt to these changing times. And so if you go into a mainline church today, it's typically a small, dwindling, very elderly population. There are still some thriving mainline churches, but it's not looking good, for those denominations. Evangelicalism, its strength and its weakness, I guess, has been its adaptability to cultural change. And so evangelicalism was able to fill the void left behind by the decline of the main lines. But I would say evangelicals came up with three basic strategies for responding to this period of decline. Two were from the positive world, one is from the neutral world. So the positive world strategies were culture war and seeker sensitivity, and the neutral world strategy was cultural engagement. So the culture war strategy got going in the 1970s, pioneered by people like Jerry Falwell of Liberty University, Moral Majority, Pat Robertson, the Christian Broadcasting Network, people like that. And the culture war people saw that things were not going the way that they liked in society. And so their idea is we need to mobilize politically to fight back. We're going to take back the country via politics. And so this entire approach was predicated on the idea of a positive world in some sense. And again, I think the very name of the paradigmatic organization of the culture war, Moral Majority, speaks to that positive world. It may not have even been true then that Christians were a moral majority, but like Nixon's silent majority, it was at least plausible to claim. Nobody would ever create an organization called Moral Majority today, at least not a Christian organization. And as part of this, evangelicals realigned from the Democrat to the Republican Party. Evangelicals were originally Democrats. Who was the first evangelical president? Jimmy Carter. You know, Jimmy Carter was a Southern Baptist Sunday school teacher, and there was a lot of concern about what it would mean for this Bible thumper Carter to get into office. And he did win, the white Baptist vote, certainly, which was kind of interesting there. 1976, the year of the Evangelical Newsweek. By the 1980s, that flipped, and evangelicals became the largest and most important voting bloc in the Republican Party. And of course, this is the religious right we still know today. It's still with us. And maybe in some respects, a very, very big piece of evangelicalism. Seeker sensitive also got started in the 1970s, pioneered by people like Bill Hybels of Willow Creek Church in suburban Chicago and Rick Warren of Saddleback Church in Orange County. What these people saw was people aren't going to church. So why don't we design a church that they'll attend? The origin story of Willow Creek is Bill Hybels went door to door in suburban Chicago, and he'd ask people, do you go to church? And if they said yes, he said, thank you. And if he said no, if they said no, he'd say, well, why don't you go to church? And as he put it, I got an earful. So he's like, I'm going to design a church to answer the objections. You know, we're not going to beg for money. We're going to get rid of the choir robes and the stodgy hymns. It's going to be, contemporary music, informality, topical therapeutic sermons, things of that nature, relevant life stuff. You can think of Rick Warren's Purpose-Driven Life as like a great example of that genre. And this is essentially what we might think of broadly as the sort of non-denominational suburban megachurch movement. That's very much still with us, in many respects represents the evangelical mainstream. This is when the boomers were really suburbanizing at that time, and this group captured them. In the neutral world in the 1990s, we saw the emergence of a third strategy called cultural engagement, pioneered by people like Tim Keller of Redeemer Presbyterian Church in New York. And I think there are a couple ways we can think about what cultural engagement is. First, you could think of it as a seeker sensitivity for the cities. Just as, Hybels and Warren had reached emerging baby boomer suburbia, Keller and people like him were reaching this emerging urban demographic that was really coming in the wake of people like Giuliani. I think a second way to think of it is as the opposite of the culture war. Rather than fighting with people all the time, why don't we take advantage of this pluralistic public square and have a conversation? Another phenomenon of the neutral world was the emerging church movement, which also really sprung up in the 90s. And if you listen to people talk about the emerging church movement, a lot of times they called it the emerging church conversation. The idea is we're just all going to get together in a bar or something like that, hold church in a bar, and we're just going to have open, free conversations about things. And again, this is, still with us today. You can think of this as the urban church movement in a sense. And so those are kind of the three main pieces. There's stuff like neo-Anabaptist doesn't really fit in there. There's a lot of, these are just rough categorizations, but I think this does represent sort of three major thrusts of evangelical strategies. But I don't think it's just, the difference between these is just strategic, is that they all just had consultants that delivered them different reports. These were very different people and groups of people. So you could think of them as having a geographic orientation, where culture war was sort of rural, small town, small city Christianity. Seeker sensitivity is suburban Christianity, and cultural engagement is urban Christianity. There are also kind of differences in sensibilities. The culture war sensibility was very fundamentalist. In fact, Jerry Falwell was literally a fundamentalist. Whereas the seeker sensitives and cultural engagers were more neo-evangelical. They wanted to reach the mainstream of society as well. And then there were sort of class matters as well in terms of what we think of as class, socioeconomic status, college educations, things of that nature. Again, so all three of these groups are alive and well. So if evangelicalism is adaptable, and it came up with these strategies for the positive and the neutral world, what about the negative world? What are the strategies for the negative world? And the reality is, there hasn't been one. The one strategy that was put forth for the negative world has been Rod Dreher's Benedict option. And when the Benedict option book came out in 2017, evangelicals basically puked on it. They didn't like it. Just as one example, Christianity Today magazine held a symposium where they asked 4 people to give their opinion on the book, and basically all 4 had significant critiques of the book. Now, some of that, just to be honest, it's Rod's own fault a little bit. He's Eastern Orthodox and formerly Catholic. He'd be the very first person to tell you that he doesn't know anything about the evangelical world. So naming your option after a monk and like using monasteries is a big part of the book just doesn't play well in Protestantism, right? Nevertheless, I think even if you discount that, I think the rejection of the Benedict option was disproportionate to those considerations. And by the way, a lot of the Catholics didn't like it either. Apparently, Pope Francis doesn't like the Benedict option. I think the reality is that people were just in denial. They didn't want to admit that the culture had fundamentally changed, because that might mean they have to change what they're doing. That business as usual isn't going to work for them. And so I think Rod has actually said that like more and more people are returning to the Benedict option now. They're finding it more appealing. But I would say, I think today there's far less denying that we live in a negative world. But the question is, what should we do? And really, evangelicals have still really not come up with strategies for it. So instead of new strategies for the negative world, I think what we've seen predominantly is sort of doubling down on what people have already been doing. And the results we've seen are deconstruction, realignment, deformation, and intra-evangelical conflict. So deconstruction, we all hear about people deconstructing their faith, often very publicly. There are so many ex-evangelical memoirs as to practically constitute its own genre. And I don't think the deconstruction phenomenon could be understood apart from the negative world. I think that is at least a part of what lies underneath some of it. Realignment is we're seeing a lot of people make changes to where they were before. Changing theological positions, changing political parties, changing their little tribe that they're affiliated with, even physically moving. So just one example of that. A ton of people moved during COVID. And in fact, I think here in Moscow, Idaho, you benefited from a lot of people who said, we want to go be around people who are more like-minded. So there was a huge reshuffling of people between churches during COVID. But I think a great example of this is the commentator David French. So 10 years ago, David French would have been classified as a hardcore culture warrior. Today, he's a New York Times columnist who spends a lot of his time attacking culture warriors. He's definitely switched teams. He's endorsing Kamala Harris for president. For example, a guy who was a card-carrying member of Conservatism, Inc. And then again, deformation is a result of doubling down on the existing strategies intersecting with the pressures of the negative world. And this is affecting, I think, all of the strategies in various ways. But I'll just give one example from the culture war strategy. I think it is a fair critique of the culture war strategy that these folks, by and large, changed their tune when it came to the importance of character as a qualification for being president of the United States. I mean, the way that they treated Bill Clinton in 1998 and the way that they treated Donald Trump in 2016, they're just different. It is. And I think a lot of it now has a sort of realpolitik or Machiavellian, perhaps, view of politics in a way that was not as much present before. But again, this is affecting everybody. And then the net result, I think, of all this has been intra-evangelical conflicts. You have these different groups that have become very polarized around certain flashpoint issues, Donald Trump being a big one, kind of woke ideologies on race being another one, and COVID kind of maybe more being an accelerant or an overlay than a separate issue of its own, really causing a lot of a fracas. And all these people are going at each other, often in public, not infrequently in the pages of places like the New York Times. And, it's quite embarrassing for us, to say the least. And so my belief is that what we need to do in this negative world is take a step back and say, okay, how should we respond to this new cultural moment? And that doesn't mean tearing up everything about the old strategies and starting with a blank sheet of paper. But I think it does mean we need to create strategies for the negative world in the way that we created them for the positive and the neutral world. And it doesn't have to involve going back and talking about how terrible all those people in the past were, or that all their leaders must have been like that. The reality is the world has changed. So we need to do something different. And again, the Benedict option would be one book on that. Another people promote something that's a little more aggressive, the Boniface option. Anybody heard of the Boniface option? Boniface was this saint who converted a German tribe by chopping down their sacred tree. It's the story. And of course, I'd be remiss if I didn't plug my own book, Life in the Negative World, which I encourage you to not buy since you're students, but check out of the library. You should make sure the university has many copies in their library for you to check out. About 75% of my book is about ideas for how to live in the negative world across the dimensions of the personal, as individuals and families, institutional, churches, ministries, Christian colleges, etc. And then missional. How do we do mission in the negative world? And so I could speak maybe 4 times as long and go through that in all detail, but I think I will actually just stop right there and try to leave some time for questions because I think we have some time. Thank you.
Thank you, Aaron. Yeah, boy, tons of thoughts flowing from that. Why don't I'll open up with, I have 2 questions, and then we'll open it up to students for you to ask your questions. The first question is paradigmatic. You have positive, neutral, and negative world, and it makes me wonder what might come next. Is it negative world forever? Or there are some signs, some strange things happening. Tucker Carlson talking about, wow, this is real evil. I think we need to stop and pray. Some interest in talking about what it would look like to have Christianity over the nation. Candace Owens becomes a Roman Catholic. You have Jordan Peterson. If somebody sneezes next to him, he's going to fall into the kingdom of God. He and Russell Brand praying the Lord's Prayer together, right? Russell Brand, new convert, baptizing other new converts in his skivvies, if you have seen that on the internet. So there's Are these signs that people really don't like negative world and we might toggle back to a neutral world? Christianity might be back in fashion?
Here's what I would say. First, we don't know what the future holds. But we know one thing, the trends that hold now are not just going to keep going in the future. I'm highly influenced by Nassim Taleb, most famous for his book, The Black Swan. He talks a lot about the fundamental uncertainty of the future. Again, if you want to read Taleb, I think Fooled by Randomness and Anti-Fragile are almost must reading. But the reality is, just think about like the last few years. Who could have predicted January 1st, 2015, nobody would have predicted Donald Trump was going to be the president 2 years later. Not even Donald Trump. He probably hadn't even really decided to run. January 1, 2020, who knew just a few months later the whole world was going to get turned upside down for 2 years by a pandemic? Who expected, this Russian invasion of Ukraine or this Hamas thing on October 7th? We don't know what's going to happen. And in fact, religion or sort of chaos and order, or however you want to think about it, has kind of ebbed and flowed in America. It's not just a one-way ratchet. The Victorian era was like very buttoned down and moralistic. The Roaring 20s were the jazz age and all of that. In the 1950s, we're back to community and kind of an order and moral and record church attendance. Then we have the 60s and 70s. Then we had kind of the Reagan era, another reconsolidation era. So I'm not suggesting we're going back to, a previous era, but I think we just don't know what the future is going to hold. So I don't make predictions about the future. I have seen a lot of people argue about this, what they call the cultural Christianity moment. And the idea, I think, here is there is a kind of a phenomenon of at least some people who may not even like Christianity all that much, but they see that they don't like this kind of woke left. They don't like the left. And they're like, wow, we need Christianity as like the underpinning for that old culture that we valued. I think there's also a sense that there's kind of a religious war against the left. And if you need a religious war, there better be a religion. And so Christianity like serves that as a sort of political religion for some people. I can't remember this gentleman's name, but I linked to it in my newsletter. A British guy who, he's not a Christian, but he had very insightful things to say about this cultural Christianity. He says, Jesus says, you'll know the tree by the fruit. And he's like, traditionally, the thing you would talk about in Christianity is people wanted the tree without the fruit. They wanted to be Christian. They wanted to go to heaven when they died, but they didn't want to produce the fruit in their life. They didn't want to mortify their sin. They didn't want to repent, right? They didn't want to love their neighbor. They didn't want to do that stuff. They just wanted the benefits. They wanted that Christianity. Now, I said, in cultural Christianity, there's a sort of inversion where people want the fruits without the tree. In this case, the fruits is they want the benefits of a Christian society without having to believe in Christianity. And I thought that was a really interesting thing. And so I think we need to be cautious in some of these people. I do hope they're genuinely Christian. I think it's very clear, if you listen to Jordan Peterson talk, at least as of a couple months ago, he is not a Christian. He doesn't believe Jesus Christ was resurrected from the dead, certainly won't say that publicly. Said, that. So, and I also think we need to be very, very, Paul warns, don't put new converts in charge too quickly. And, every time there's a celebrity conversion, I always get a little nervous. Remember when Kanye was putting out there? What happened to Kanye? And so, you look at Russell Brand and some of these people, I don't like, I really feel it's a big problem that Jordan Peterson and Russell Brand are very high-profile public spokesmen for Christianity. I do not think that is a healthy thing for us, and I do not think we should look to them for leadership. That's one thing I would say. I think, we're like cheap dates sometimes. Somebody became Richard Dawkins is now saying that like Christianity isn't totally evil. Isn't that amazing? Maybe we should invite him to speak to us or something. I hope you're not inviting him, but like that's one of these things. Like
that would be a debate. We'd have a debate.
I think there's an element. There's great. Doug Wilson did a great tour of the nation with Christopher Hitchens doing debates. That must have been like a lot of fun. But I'm a little cautious about this cultural Christianity phenomenon because the thing about Christianity is not just a functional belief system. It's got to be true. And this is what you see. This is what's kind of sad. You look at a lot of these secular thinkers. Robert Putnam is an example, the documenting the decline of social capital. And you see a lot of these guys, you talk about like what you get coming out of church. We need to have people involved in religious communities, but you look at it like they don't really seem to believe personally. You have to actually believe it. But I do think that it's by no means, and I reject the idea that Christianity has a slow motion going out of business sale in the United States. This may be one area where I differ from Rod Dreher. He's very pessimistic, very bleak. He likes to quote from the book, The Final Pagan Generation, which I've done. It's kind of like, Christianity, it's going extinct, just like paganism. I think we can have a very bright future for Christianity in America, brighter than we think possible, but it might take a long time to get there, maybe beyond the span of my lifetime. I'm 54 years old. The Summer of Love was 2 years before I was born. Think about how long it took for many of these ideas to percolate through our society, even with massive backing. And so I think we should be humble about that. We need to think like cathedral builders. People who are building projects that it will be children, grandchildren, and descendants we won't even know who complete and benefit from those. A perspective that extends beyond the span of our own lives.
I'm going to forego my second question, so we have enough time to hear a couple questions from students. And we don't have a mic, so stand up and make sure you speak loud.
All right, so let's say that in society, public hostility just like radically keeps increasing. Do you think it will be possible for evangelicals who've kind of grown up in this context of American nationalism, will it be possible for evangelicals to exist in potentially a post-national world or in a world where state capacity declines or something like the Lodge's network state in society?
Yeah, there's kind of two aspects of that. What does it look like to live under a very, very hostile society? And then what does it look like in a disintegrating kind of environment? That was the whole idea of the Benedict option is that, and this is way too complex. I have a whole other lecture I could give on this, and I've given it, is, the idea, and this is from Alistair McIntyre's After Virtue, the last paragraph of After Virtue, he talks about men of goodwill like Benedict ceasing to identify the continuation of civilization with the maintenance of the Roman Imperium, because Rome had collapsed. The institutions of Rome had collapsed. They turned aside from propping up the empire and said, let's create a new type of thing, the monastery, the new forms of community. And, I think we do have to think about, to what extent, I'm not a big fan of picking fights with people, so I'm kind of a skeptical of the culture war. But I do think, do we need to actively invest in propping up and maintaining the globalist American empire that does so many bad things? And so I think maybe we could say, no, we don't need to become actively complicit in propping that up. We'll pay our taxes, we'll do our civic duty, we'll be good citizens, but we're focused on this thing we're doing over here. So I'm a little bit inspired by the New Testament church, what I think was, if you look at Paul's letters, remarkably unconcerned about what the Roman Empire was doing, very concerned about what the church was doing. And I think maybe we should have more of that mindset.
We have time for one more question with a brief response. Yes.
So there's a New York Times article that came out in the past 2 weeks that actually noted for the first time in several generations And granted, this is the New York Times. There are more, I think there's a larger percentage of young men in Gen Z who are attending church than young women. I wanted to hear your comments.
Well, that'll be my opportunity to pitch my newsletter, aaronrenn.com. And I actually just wrote something last week about that article. I think it's going to have a profound impact on the church, but predominantly that is happening because of an accelerated abandonment of Christianity by young women, not because of increased religiosity by young men. Although there's some signs that it is picking up among young men. What we're seeing on a global basis is gender polarization, political polarization by gender, with women being very far to the left, men being at least somewhat to the right, and this being overlaid on society. South Korea is the most advanced example of this. I say global because it's not just about us. But I would say if religion becomes right-coded, becomes coded as conservative, which it basically is, then I think it's going to have naturally more of an appeal to men who identify as conservative, maybe less appeal to women who identify as liberals. And so I think that the overlay of political and gender polarization on this will have profound consequences for the church, perhaps not entirely healthy, but it's a trend to watch.
Aaron, thank you for taking the time.
Thank you.
Lovely, and we'll close with our song.